It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Neelesh Patankar, who comes to us from Northwestern University. He's currently the Associate Chair of the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Northwestern University. His group research, which is a fairly significant group size, about 15 people in all, is focused on four primary and very interesting missions. First, develop fully resolved computational fluid dynamics techniques to simulate muscle-activated movement of organisms, which I think probably you'll talk about a little bit today. Second, to use CFD theory, computational fluid dynamics theory, to understand the neural control of movement, to design novel underwater vehicles. Again, another very interesting topic. Thirdly, to establish the foundational science of controlling phase as an anti-icing, frosting, anti-frosting, boiling, condensation kind of stuff. And lastly, we were just talking about to establish new metrics to quantify the mileage efficiency and greenhouse emissions of automotive vehicles. And he was just explaining that funding from the US EPA is kind of drying up on that stuff. But anyway, the subject of this talk is computational biophysics of organisms and organ physiology, and if you put all those words together and try and figure out what each of them means, it's a very interesting combination of things. So I think you'll find the talk very interesting. Neelesh?
Thank you. Well, thanks to Caroline, Jerry, and Pega. Actually, I'm here as her external examiner, and she did pass, in case some of her friends are wondering. So, yeah, I feel privileged today and tell you why. There is a major world event going on right now. Which one is it?
World Cup.
The fact that you could not answer, that's why you are here. Okay. So anyway, so thanks for coming. And the score right now is 0-0. Okay, I'm following it here. So, okay, so a lot of things there. Of course, computational, you understand what it is. Biophysics, basically physics of biological things. Organisms, organs, obvious. Physiology means function of these things. All right, so that is what I'm going to say. And my agenda today is fairly ambitious. I hope that I will do so in the allotted time. Otherwise, I'll just skip some of the things that I was planning on talking. So what do we do in my group? Like it was said already, we do applied math stuff like this, developing new computational formulations specifically for fluid structure problems, and then application, which is more like applied physics and mechanical engineering, where our application areas are fish locomotion, esophageal transport, swallowing process. This and that is what I'm going to talk about today. And then we also do car aerodynamics, and the funding is not drying up, it has dried up. Okay, so and you can guess why it has happened. And then there is, of course, surface engineering, where you are trying to develop anti-icing and good boiling surfaces. So actually, I'm going to skip next two slides. I will come to it if necessary later. So, so this video here basically summarizes the application areas for today, which is there is this particular fish which in real life looks like that. And this is a simulation of it swimming forward and backward. As you can see, it swims using traveling waves on this long fin at the bottom. And when it swims forward, it is straight forward. When it swims back, it is back and up. Okay. So, and this is consistent with experiments. And this is a simplified stomach with this as the esophagus trying to put food in the stomach. Of course, now we have the actual stomach model as well, which I haven't brought in today to show you. So before we go to this application, what I want to discuss is what is the computational tool that we use to do this. And I cannot get into the details of it, but I just want to tell a high-level story. So you kind of get some orientation as to what is the state of the art in doing so. So the method that is used is immersed body computations, and I'm purposely not using the classical term immersed boundary methods. Those of you in CFD probably recognize immersed boundary method. I'm going to talk about it shortly. Now this is more like a unifying formulation that encompasses two major advances that happened in this field, okay? And in this field meaning moving immersed bodies in fluids, okay? So what was the first one? Starting with 1970s, okay, at Courant, this immersed boundary method was basically invented by Charlie Peshkin. And what he tried to do was basically using fiber architecture, model a heart and try to simulate a beating heart. It's a fairly hard problem, and therefore the idea was the following, okay, that everything is a fluid, okay, so you don't differentiate solid domain and fluid domain. You solve for fluid equations everywhere. In that fluid are immersed these structural fibers which make up the heart, and it has elastic forces, and those elastic forces are then transmitted to the fluid somehow. How, we don't worry about it. And therefore that fluid that is actually in that solid domain starts behaving as if it is a solid, okay? So that is the basic idea, all right? So fluid everywhere, and then do something to the fluid so that that part of the fluid where there is actually solid will behave like a solid, okay? And this was for elastic material immersed in body. And then simultaneously, through the 70s and 80s, Glowinski, they formulated this distributed Lagrange multiplier method. And the idea here is the following. Look at this plot here. There are two circles here, which are supposed to be two rigid circles, cylinders, that are falling. The idea here was again simple. These are rigid cylinders now, not elastic, okay? So the whole idea was that you again assume everything is a fluid, but in the region where you actually have a cylinder, that fluid in that region, you constrain it to move in a rigid manner, okay? Meaning that you disallow that fluid to have deformation, okay? So you only allow rigid motion in that. So you add constraint which gives rise to forces within the fluid in that region, and you solve it, okay? So that was the idea. And then through my own work, I had the fortunate opportunity to work with these people, and then I extended this actually to swimming bodies, okay? Which seemingly looks elastic, but if I know the deformation kinematics, the only unknown for that swimming body is its rigid motion, okay? So you can use the same trick here, and if you are clever, you can solve for a swimming body with known kinematics. And here, notice that the turning velocity and the forward velocity of this fish is being computed by solution not specified, okay? So that is the key point if you want to know the details. Okay, so my first goal right now is to convince you that these two seemingly different formulations are basically two special cases of a unified formulation, okay? So that is something that is new that I would like to claim here. So what is that unified formulation? Okay, so now again I'm going to talk high level. There is a lot of applied math that went in it in order to get these simple looking equations, which I will avoid. Okay, so here if you are in CFD especially, you will recognize this right away. This is a fluid equation, okay, Newton's second law of motion. So mass times acceleration per unit volume is equal to the net force at different points, okay? So this is inertia term. This would be mu del square u plus minus gradient of p, if you use constitutive form for this sigma f, which is stress in the fluid, and plus some lambda, okay? And this lambda is the additional force that you need to put in the fluid that is actually occupying the solid domain, so that that solid domain, that fluid moves like a solid domain in that part, okay? So how you get that lambda, don't worry about it right now. But the bottom line is you solve this fluid equation everywhere in the domain, including the solid domain, with this lambda being non-zero in the solid domain, so that the fluid will move like a solid, okay? Now, of course, if you go to the solid part, this is not the equation of the solid. First of all, the inertia is wrong. Secondly, the stresses are wrong. Basically, everything is wrong. Okay, so you start correcting it. You need to generate an equation for the solid. So this is what you have. So you correct this inertia. Okay, subtract out the fluid inertia, add the solid inertia. This is solid velocity. Note, this is US and that is UF, U solid, U fluid. But this equation is only in the solid domain, by the way. You correct the delta sigma, meaning you subtract the fluid stress and add the solid stress, which would be based on elasticity, for example. This is some external body force, you can ignore it. This is simply gravitational force, you can ignore it. And then there is this minus lambda b, okay? For all practical purposes, consider this to be same as this lambda, because it is, okay? This lambda has lambda b plus surface forces, okay? So that's why I'm differentiating it, but otherwise it is simple. So in the bulk, why do we have this plus here and minus there? Because when you add these two equations, this lambda must cancel, this inertia must cancel with that, this stress must cancel with the minus of stress of there, and what you should end up getting by adding these two equations is the solid equation, all right? So that is how now you can easily see why I have this correction equation in the solid domain, okay? So now I have equation for the fluid, equation for the solid in the solid domain, right? Fluid domain everywhere, but I still don't know how to get an equation for lambda, all right? And there you put this constraint that the fluid, which is actually in the solid part, that fluid velocity must be same as the solid velocity. That is the constraint you have to put. And that is what you do here. This is simply mass conservation, which I'm not going to talk about. Divergence velocity equal to 0 for incompressible. And this is that constraint. So this is a constraint that actually becomes the equation for lambda. So lambda is the Lagrange multiplier corresponding to this constraint that the velocity of the fluid and the solid must match. Okay, so that is the bottom line over there. All right. So far so good. So this is the unified constraint formulation. Seems very straightforward in hindsight. Now I'm going to try to convince that depending on how you solve these equations, you will end up getting the classical immersed boundary method or the constraint-based method of Glowinski. Okay. So that is this next part. Okay. So what you do is, okay, these are the same equations from before that I have written here. Now I'm going to mark certain areas. So when you have immersed boundary methods, right, for elastic bodies, what you do is basically in step 1 in that algorithm, right, you solve this momentum equation or Newton's second law, okay? And don't worry about whether I know this lambda or not. You will see that you will know it. But you solve this equation assuming lambda is known, okay? So you solve for this fluid velocity everywhere in the domain, okay, including the solid domain. Then in step 2, you impose this constraint, meaning that whatever fluid velocity you've got in the solid domain, you say that your solid velocity is same as that fluid velocity in that region. So that is basically like imposing this constraint. That is step 2. Once you know how the solid points are moving, now you deform that body based on that velocity. All right? And then you apply this third equation in order to calculate that lambda based on the elastic stresses in that. This is how immersed boundary method works. Okay? And so therefore, this is just depending on how I solve, the overall governing equation, the strong form is the same, nothing changed. Okay? So that is the classical immersed boundary method. Okay? So that is step 3. Now I'm going to convince you that that constraint method is the same again as this formulation, except it is solved differently. Okay? So how? I think I personally like it because I came up with that, but you can judge it, okay? So now how do we solve this problem? Okay, and I'm going to take the example not of a rigid body, but purposely I want to take a deforming body like a fish, okay? So here what is done is these two equations are solved together, okay? And of course there is that divergence of velocity equal to 0 out there, which I'm not bothering about because that gives pressure, okay? So don't worry about that. So I have these two equations that I solved together. The first equation is equation for UF. The second equation is equation for lambda, like a Lagrange multiplier. I somehow solve this together. In concept, you can agree that that can be done. And then what ends up happening is this second equation right here, which was the correction for the solid, actually that is not very relevant other than in its integrated form. What I mean by that, you will see in the next slide. But right now, just imagine I'm saying that this equation is irrelevant point-wise. Only the integrated version of that is relevant. How that happens is the story of the next slide. Okay? So, however, if you want to know the point-wise forces that will cause that particular animal to swim, okay, you can post-process and calculate that force field that caused a certain swimming motion by using this equation. Okay, so this equation is still useful, but as a post-processing step, okay, point-wise. Otherwise, only its integrated version is relevant, as we will see in the next slide. All right. So let us come to that. So how do we solve that equation together? So again, this is the momentum equation. Somehow I need to get an equation for lambda. So if you count number of equations and a number of unknowns, this is a vector equation, and these are 3 unknowns here. Okay, divergence of velocity equal to 0 is the equation for pressure. I'm not going to bother about that. And now I need to somehow generate equation for lambda. All right. So that equation is this constraint equation, that velocity of the fluid must be constrained to be that of the solid at each point in the solid domain. But here I have expanded out that expression for U solid into 2 parts. First part is the deformation component of the velocity field of the solid, which we presume is known, because if you know how a particular animal deforms its body, let's say traveling wave sinusoidal, right? So you know this deformation field. And so what is only unknown in the solid velocity field is its translational velocity, this big US, and its rotational velocity, this omega s. And cross r is the vector relative to its center of mass. All right. So I can write this constraint in terms of its rigid motion, which is unknown, and its deformation kinematics, which is known. All right. So now, of course, in order to get an equation for this lambda, which in principle, this is that equation, I'm adding 2 more unknowns, US and omega s. Okay. So how do I solve for that? For that, you need integrated version of this solid correction equation that I told before. Okay, so that's what we are going to do, and you integrate that, and that becomes the equation for the translational velocity of the solid, which is the one here. You take a moment of that, you get the rotational velocity of that body, and then a lot of simplifications end up happening if you have a body whose density is same as the fluid. Okay, and what happens is these terms drop out. All right. So you end up getting these sets of equations. So it is a simple balance of a number of equations and number of unknowns. This is equation for UF. This is equation for lambda. And equation for this US is this. And equation for that omega s is that. What does it physically tell you? It physically tells me that if you integrate this lambda over the entire fish domain, there cannot be any finite value for it. It has to be 0. And it makes complete sense, because integral of lambda over a fish body would be non-zero only if somebody is holding that fish and pulling it. If it is self-propelling, that integral has to be 0. Okay? So that is what that is telling you physically. And similarly, this is the moment equation, right? That nobody is holding the fish and twisting it. So if it is generating its propulsion by its own deformations, there cannot be a net moment for this external lambda. All right, so that is what it is telling you. And now you have a set of well-posed problem. Of course, I'm not telling you how I'm going to solve it numerically, but that is another story. But this, again, these equations become the equations that was an entirely different looking algorithm before. But really, the bottom line is that it is all governed by the same set of equations. All right. So that is probably the hardest part of this talk so far. Okay, so now if you're beginning to fall asleep, you can wake up, all right? Because the rest of the part, yeah, in my class what I do is I make students stand up and start jumping, because that's how you make your blood start flowing. All right, so self-propulsion. Now we are going to application, okay? So I've developed this nice algorithm. Now remember, there is this elastic version that I had, and there was this constraint version, meaning the propulsion, right? So I have 2 applications to represent each of those areas. The elastic version is the swallowing problem, and then the swimming problem is the one that I'm going to talk next, okay? All right, so why do we study swimming? Okay, why did we study swimming? A variety of reasons. For biological questions, because we wanted to understand how neural control of movement happens. I won't get into that story today. I'll talk about the engineering motivation, which was, there is this knifefish. You saw the video how it moves before. Can we make a small, this size underwater robot for different applications? Okay, so that is the goal. We are staying away from robots of this kind, which is that the whole body deforms. Rather, we are going with this type of fish because it holds part of its body rigid, and therefore it is easier to carry stuff, right, if it is not deforming. So that was our motivation. Of course, the robotics people are my collaborators. I don't develop robot myself, but I collaborate with them. So just to remind you, this is how that fish moves, okay? So this is the shape. There is that long fin up there, and it has undulations. Remember those undulations. If the undulations go backward, the fish swims forward and vice versa. And remember two things here, because it will come back as you look at this video, that there is a traveling wave, okay? And then there is flapping of that fin with respect to the base. So there is a flapping motion and a traveling wave motion, okay? So remember those two things. All right. So now I want to see what role hydrodynamics has played in the morphology of that fish, or how it moves, and whether those lessons I can use in engineering. Okay, so that is what I'm going to do. And of course, if you see these types of fish, these particular species, these are different species, you see that they do have some kind of a streamlining shape. And you can verify that, of course, that this streamlining does help it reduce its body drag as it swims straight ahead. Okay, so that's a no-brainer. That shape is clearly streamlined. Okay, whether in evolution it evolved that shape because of this hydrodynamics or not, you can never be sure. But this definitely suggests that the way it evolved is in line with these hydrodynamic efficiency. Okay, so that is one. Next thing is, look at this fish. When you hold it straight, as in its forward swimming mode, this fin is attached at an angle. It is not straight, it is at an angle to its body. Now, why would that be, right? So we did calculations, and then we realized that the traveling wave component of that fin produces a forward thrust along that direction that you see there. The flapping component produces a perpendicular force along that arrow. And the resultant of this force will be straight ahead only if that fin is attached at an angle to its body. So we computed what that angle will be, and it turned out to be around 10 to 15 degrees. So we went in Harvard, with our collaborators, George Lauder, whose name is right here. They have a museum where they have all these different kinds of fish with, so we got data from them looking at what angles these fins had. And all these fish in real field, they have this angle of between 10 to 15 degrees, consistent with our hydrodynamic calculations. So perhaps, again, right, this is circumstantial evidence, but this suggests that perhaps hydrodynamic pressures in terms of efficiency of swimming did play a role in the evolution of its morphology. Okay, so this is a biologist would be interested in that. As an engineer, probably you don't care. Okay, but you will care if you are building an artificial underwater vehicle. But this, admittedly, is a terrible solution if you are having a propeller which is at an angle to the body. Okay, so but there are other ways to neutralize it. And that is what you basically see in this. Now you do these arrows I'm showing for its forward swimming, right? Imagine that the traveling wave is reversed, right? And you do this same force balance, and you find out what is the resultant arrow direction. It will not be straight back. It will be back and up. That is why in this simulation that we have done, you see that it swims straight ahead, and when it reverses, it swims back and up. And as a matter of fact, real fish have exactly that kind of motion. In fact, so capturing that in our simulations was one of our test cases to see whether it is agreeing with experiments or not. Okay, so this is one part of the story. But there are harder questions out there which we set about answering. Okay, so what were those questions? Okay, so if you like an interesting story, I'm going to tell you, I think, 2 or 3 more stories about this particular fish. And I think some of those would be interesting to you. The first one is too intricate, so I'm going to tell you only the last part, which is this fin height. The next one is optimal specific wavelength, meaning you saw that there were waves on that fin as it formed traveling wave. What should be the wavelength? How many waves should you have? 1, 2, 10, 6, right? So that is the question. And then how do you decide efficiency? I will define that problem later. And then I will just tease you with some simulations of neuromechanics, although there is no time to discuss the details of how we are going about doing it. And again, here I want to make a case, and I was telling you earlier that I want to convince you that although this is all about biology, this is actually all about physics. Okay, And you can ask clever questions. Of course, I'm pretending to be clever here, but you can ask clever questions and get good insights into the function of these biological species. Okay, so all right. So here is a thought experiment for you. Let's say you are designing a robot or that fish. Okay, you are playing God, and you have decided that this particular animal is going to have a fin all along its length. That is a design decision which also might be based on some reason, but we are going to pretend that decision has been made, and you are going to have a fin through the whole length of the body. Now the question for you is, I tell you, go to a fin shop, okay, and pick a fin of that length, which means you can pick different heights. What should be the height of that fin that you should pick? All right. So then, of course, we did this computationally, and we checked different fin heights, okay, as attached to that body. And then we realized, okay, but it has to optimize something. The fin height must be good for something, okay? And that something was, if I am a self-propelled body, just like cars, if you're driving, what you care about how many miles you get per gallon, right? So you do the inverse of that instead of, in Canada, what do you do? Miles per gallon, or is the opposite?
We do the SI one.
Pardon me?
We don't do gallon, we do liter.
No, but is it a distance per liter, or is it liter per distance?
Liter per 100 kilometers.
Yeah.
You guys are smart, okay? I'm telling you, that is the right metric, that is the right way to do it, and actually biologists do that, okay? They call it cost of transport, meaning what is the energy needed, liters, per unit distance you go, okay? So that is cost. So we said that let us attach fins of different height to this body and find out what is the cost of transport, okay? And if there is a fin height at which that cost of transport is minimum, right? You want to minimize it, right? Then that's the one I want, okay? So in fact, we did that, which is this plot, and we found, and we took the geometric measures of the actual fish, okay? So we wanted to check whether nature has optimized, okay? So this is cost of transport, okay? Energy per unit distance traveled versus different fin heights. And we found that there was a minimum around a fin height of 1 centimeter, okay? And in fact, we looked up again data, right? Like I said in the previous case, and it turns out that all these fish in that particular size range that we tested in our simulations, they do have fin within that central band that you have, okay? So this central band is located right around the minimum that we found computationally. So again, circumstantial evidence that these fin heights have evolved to be such that basically it is near the minimum for cost of transport. So you are trying to minimize the cost for the distance you're going. That makes sense, right? Of course, you can present this in a non-dimensional fashion, which I have not done because generally biologists prefer it in dimensional form. Okay, so that's how we have done that. So that is that question. Okay, so so we are here. So now let us go to this next question. Okay, so now you have picked your fin. Okay, and your next question to answer is now you have to move that fin. Okay, or imagine you are making a robot. Okay, so what should be the wavelength, right, of my, let's say I've decided my frequency of oscillation. Okay, what should be the wavelength of my wave, okay, on that body? Okay, so that is the next question. So again, to remind you this video, look at how many ups and downs it has, and you will see this fish has around 2. Okay, so why 2? Why not 10 or 6? Okay, so that is the question we went about looking for an answer for. And then what we did was this. For whatever reason, which I won't get into, we thought that this wavelength to this amplitude of flapping, those were important, those 2 factors, because both affect the force produced, the propulsion force produced by this fin. Okay, so we defined a non-dimensional parameter lambda, the wavelength divided by the amplitude of movement of this flapping. Okay, so lambda over a, and we found that it produces maximum thrust when this lambda over a has a certain value around 20. Okay, Of course, if you're an engineer, you're done, right? You go and tell your collaborator, please activate your fin at that ratio, okay? And actually, we did experiments to activate it at different ratios as well, and experimentally, this result was verified, okay? So that was, as a matter of fact, I don't have those results here, but there are similar graphs exactly like these that are from robots experiments, okay? Again, we were like curious, do animals follow this rule, right? And so we went around looking for all these long-finned animals for which data were available, okay? And people had documented its lambda and A. We took that ratio, and we even did an evolutionary, put it on an evolutionary tree I'm going to show you next, and we prepared this kind of a plot. So what this shows is this. Let us go from right to left, okay? So we calculated this lambda over A for all these different animals here which have long fins, and their value was indeed around 20, okay? Which is the optimal value that we got, which means once again, nature seems to have adjusted itself based on this hydrodynamic efficiency. Now, why do this? What was the need for this evolutionary tree? Okay, as to where in the evolutionary tree do these organisms, which you can't see very clearly, you can look at our paper, which is in PLOS Biology, what is so special about this particular diagram? So I want to bring your attention to these facts. So look at this. This is blue. I don't know if you can see clearly. This is blue, okay? But the species before that is in black, okay? So these are the two species which are represented here, but their ancestor did not have that long fin, okay? So now you will see, you can count how many blues are there. 1, 2, I think there will be 8, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, okay? So 8 times these blues are there such that their ancestor does not have that feature. What that means is that at least 4 times this trait, this lambda over A equal to 20, has evolved independently of its ancestor. So it's not like this solution was found at one ancient ancestor and then it got propagated to all its descendants. Not true, okay? So this is called convergent evolution, meaning that multiple times nature found the same solution, okay? And our eyes are one example of that, okay? Convergent evolution. And this is another one in biology, okay? So where one could hypothesize that physics perhaps played a role, okay? I'm making very tentative statements here, but these are things where you cannot be precisely sure that, evolution did get affected by these things, okay? Necessarily, because there are so many other factors. But it is most likely to have been the case, all right? So forget about that slide. And then why does that optimum happen? So whenever you have a maximum or a minimum, right, as a physics person, you immediately want to start thinking that there must be at least 2 mechanisms which are competing with each other as one model for this. And in between those values, it finds an optimal, right? So what are those 2 mechanisms? So 2 mechanisms are this, that when the wavelength is small compared to the amplitude A over there of that wave, imagine your hand cupping fluid and pushing it back, right? Shallower your shape, you can hold less water and push it back. Deeper, the better, right, to push. So the thrust force increases if this lambda is small, okay? But the downside of it is that this wave speed, the speed with which you are pushing the fluid down, is lambda times f. So if lambda is small, the speed with which you are pushing the fluid down goes down, all right? So in fact, in order to create forward momentum, you want to push it with faster velocity backward, right? And that will happen if this wavelength is longer. So there are these 2 competing mechanisms, and in between, you get this sweet spot where lambda over A equal to around 20 ends up giving you the best thrust, okay? So that is what that story is. I'm going to skip those slides. So that was this optimization story, okay? So now let me come to efficiency story, okay? So like I said, in terms of a real story, this is the last one, and then I'm just going to show you some simulations. Okay, so here is the efficiency question, okay? So you have a car, and I have these 2 shapes here. These, to your eyes, look the same. I have, of course, taken the first image and made it smaller. But imagine I actually make these two types of cars, and both are functioning at a Reynolds number which is in the inertial regime, okay? And I say that for some technical accuracy, but if you don't care about it, don't worry. But you know what is a drag coefficient. If you're a mechanical engineering student, you need to know that, okay? So if I ask you, and I give you that both these cars have a drag coefficient of 0.3, okay, which is typical cars, modern day cars. And I ask you, okay, which is a better aerodynamic shape? What would be your answer? I'm actually asking you guys. Both are functioning in the inertial regime. Both have the same drag coefficient. Which is a better aerodynamic shape?
The one which spends less energy to get to that.
Okay, so now that is the efficiency. You are answering a different question, which is my next question. But good attempt, right? The answer is both are aerodynamically equivalent. And of course, I need a definition for what I define as equivalent aerodynamic. And the definition is based not on drag, but based on drag coefficient, which is a non-dimensional parameter. Because I can go and say that, okay, the one that produces less drag is a better aerodynamic shape. That is a terrible definition, because a small car by its size, by physics, is going to give you less drag, okay? So for a given size, once you scale it, is it the best you can get for that size? That is the real question you need to answer, okay? And therefore, you will see that the answer to that question is more drag is obviously bigger car, but because their drag coefficients are same, they are aerodynamically equivalent, as long as they are functioning in the inertial regime. Okay, that is how we answer this question. So now let's apply that question to energy, the question that you were answering, right? Now I ask you which has more mileage, right? Or, you know, in the Canadian way, you can think which one will require more energy or less energy to go a certain distance, all right? And the answer is, just by physics, that the smaller car is going to need less energy, okay, to move a certain distance. If you don't see how that is, you need to just take my word for it, right? So it's obvious, really, right? So now the question is, does it mean that the smaller car is more efficient machine, right? As a consumer, you might buy the smaller car because for a given dollar amount, you are going to get more miles, okay? That is a different question altogether, okay? But I'm saying that as a machine of that size, which one is more efficiently designed? And this question is not easy to answer, okay? And the way we answered that was exactly like drag coefficient was developed to answer the aerodynamic question. And we said that quantifying the cost of transport is not a good way. Non-dimensional cost of transport is the right way to answer that question, okay? So we call that energy consumption coefficient, CE. I'm going to define that on the next slide. So this is our definition. Forget about this non-dimensionalization factor, but imagine that this is equivalent to this. So this drag is equivalent to cost of transport. This scaling of drag is equivalent to this scaling there, okay? So we non-dimensionalized mileage, right, and plotted that, okay? And now remember how drag coefficient is a function of Reynolds number and everything falls on a single trend. So we wanted to check whether CE has a single trend, especially for the animals that are, you know, out there. And animals, swimming animals and flying animals, okay? So we did that, and as it turns out, there is a low Reynolds number regime. For CE, we have versus mass, but you could think of that as like a Reynolds number. Low Reynolds number regime transitioning to high Reynolds number regime. All swimming animals for which data were available, they fall all on a single trend. And these are all flying animals. They are usually shifted up because in order to stay afloat, they have higher frequency, okay? So at smaller size, they are at higher Reynolds number, okay? So that is what they do. And everything collapses on a single curve. If you want to see animals, this is how it looks, okay? So they all fall on a single trend. That is, I think, quite remarkable, okay? And this particular thing, actually, I didn't even think of making this because this received some media attention. One of the reporters said that the previous figure, he doesn't care, okay, because it's just dots. can you put animals instead of those dots? And this is what we produced for that person. And just for your comparison, as an analogy, this is how the drag coefficient curve looks, as you know, versus Reynolds number, except this is with respect to mass here. Okay? So this is how we can define efficiency. And now this metric I can use in order to design my underwater vehicle as well. Okay? And I can know how good or bad I have designed it. Okay? So coming to the car story, right? So how did we make it relevant to car? Very quickly in one slide. So actually, because I'm in US, I defined it back to miles per gallon. Okay? So instead of non-dimensionalizing cost of transport, I non-dimensionalized miles per gallon. Okay? So real mileage divided by ideal mileage, which is like that scaling I told you about. And we found from data from EPA, as a matter of fact, that the mileage efficiency of the cars are around 10% today. And it has increased steadily from the time data have been collected. What does that mean? If you're driving a 30 mile per gallon car, which is a typical one today, right? And somebody gives you a hybrid car saying, oh, I'm going to give you 100 miles per gallon, equivalent. But it basically is comparing apples and apples, okay? Should you be happy or sad, right? That is the question, because I had that question, okay? So because I really don't care what I'm getting today and what you are giving me. What I care is what you are giving me relative to the ideal limit. I know very well that one cannot reach the ideal limit, but I want to know how far I am from the ideal limit, not where I am today, right? So the answer to that is that the ideal limit for the driving pattern in US is 300 miles per gallon, okay? And what you get is 30 miles per gallon, okay? So that is that 10%. So I think that does put things in perspective in terms of understanding this. And here is a shocker, that's what I just said. World record for mileage is 12,600 miles per gallon, okay? This is a real car in a competition, look it up, Pack Car 2, okay? So there is a wiki page on that, and we have a paper on that. And in fact, you can go to this website where you can go and pick your car model of choice and find out this efficiency number for that car. This is the one that we have made, by the way, for general use. All right, so in terms of neuromechanics, this is a simulation of a fish that is being activated neuronally, meaning that we are giving now muscle movements, not kinematics of swimming. And it is swimming, and then we are trying to answer different questions, such as how would this fish go in smaller circle or bigger circle? How will it avoid a gush of wind within this band, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we are trying to understand its feedback as to how it senses its surrounding and changes its motion. Okay, so these are some of the things we are trying to do. So in the remaining 10-15 minutes, I will do this last topic, which is esophageal transport. Okay, here again, I'll try to tell you 2 to 3 stories just to understand the way of thinking. Okay, and I will skip some slides which are on details. Okay, so the way it looks is like this. It's very simple, but these are heroic simulations because there are different muscle layers. This blue is something called a mucosal layer, which is like our skin, which kind of slides along. The black layer here is muscles, which are circular muscles and longitudinal muscle fibers. I'll show you a picture of that. And this is the bolus that is being squeezed down. Okay, so these muscles contract, both circular as well as longitudinal, and it pushes the bolus down. Okay, so this is this part. Of course, there is a stomach part also, which we do. So I'm going to skip this. And we use that to we work with MDs to try to understand different diseases that they are interested in and try to give them mechanistic understanding of why those pathologies might develop. Okay, so that is our overall goal. I won't get into the details of that. So in terms of stories, right? So here is one story, which is a textbook story as far as that field is concerned, right? That if you see the black part that I showed you, the muscle part, right? And if you stain the fibers of those muscle, you see that there are these longitudinal fibers and there are circular fibers, okay? So in our numerical model, that is what we do. So these are, of course, concentric with each other. I have just separated those two things so you can see it clearly. So green is the circular fibers and red is the vertical fibers. Now, as a mechanics person, you would think that the circular fiber contracts and squeezes the food down, right? However, what happens is wherever the circular fiber contracts, the longitudinal fiber also contracts. So why? That is the question. And one of the things that was hypothesized, right, by people in the field was longitudinal contraction reduces the length of that muscle. And in order to conserve volume, right, for an incompressible material, the cross-section thickness changes. Makes sense, right? And the inner radius goes down, and that also helps push the food down, okay? So both circular muscle contraction as well as longitudinal muscle contraction are required to be able to shove the food down into your stomach. That was the hypothesis. It did not make much sense to us as mechanicians, okay? So we set about showing that, and that is the next slide. And what you see here is, let me do it carefully because I need to start different. Okay, so this is just circular muscle. Oops. This is just longitudinal muscle. It's too much of my finger expertise, so forget about the circular plus longitudinal, okay? So as you can see, when it is only circular muscles activated, you can swallow. When it is just longitudinal activation, you cannot swallow. And of course, if I had shown you circular plus longitudinal, it also works, okay? So clearly, for the function of swallowing, circular is the key, not longitudinal, all right? So if there is a swallowing problem because of this muscle activation, the recommendation is that the physicians focus on the activation of the circular muscle, and there's no need to worry about a longitudinal muscle, okay? So that is, clinically relevant information. Now, obviously, the next question is, with all the stories I've told you before, right? Perhaps biology has come up with these solutions because there is some functional relevance, right? So why is longitudinal muscle there, right? And of course, we also know from the case of panda that you need not have a certain morphology that is functional, all right? There are things that are there for actually no good reason, okay? So is longitudinal muscle like that? So our hypothesis was this, that when longitudinal muscle contracts, it does thicken the cross-section of the wall. And it thickens it exactly where the circular muscles are contracted, and therefore high stresses and pressures are generated, all right? So it makes the wall stronger where it should be stronger, all right? So now, if you have places in our human anatomy where the longitudinal muscles are either absent or weak, you should have some pathology developed there, okay? So we went around and looked, and in fact, there is a phenomenon called hernia diverticulum, where these bulges emerge in these kind of tubular structures, and this is one example. As a matter of fact, in case of esophagus, there is a location just, as you can see, this is the mouth here, just on the backside of the neck, where the longitudinal muscles are almost absent. There is that opening, weakness there. And that is where, in fact, sometimes this esophagus mucosal layer bulges out and forms a diverticulum, all right? And there are many other cases kind of to support that evidence. So again, circumstantial evidence, but it seems to suggest that the functional value of longitudinal muscle contraction is to make the wall stronger and stop such pathologies from forming, okay? So that is one way in which we kind of try to contribute to the understanding. The second example is, look at this white thing. This red is that muscle layer. This white is, in fact, the mucosal layer. So when you're swallowing, this right now is closed. It opens up, and there will be a hole in there, just like this one, through which the food will pass, okay? So this white is shown in blue here, okay, which is the mucosal layer, which I said slides like our skin, okay? So again, the functional value of that was not considered to be important, okay, clinically, all right? And our claim was that it is probably not true, okay? Because what we thought was this thing, when the bolus is going down, actually, if you see the next slide, we see that these muscles kind of slide down, okay? That mucosal layer kind of slides down. So it acts more like a solid lubricant, right? Like you would have a slip region, which kind of lubricates the flow of the bolus and helps the bolus transport. So now in computations, I can make this mucosal layer non-compliant. and make it not slide and see whether I can swallow equally efficiently or not. And we did that. And actually we saw that if with a rigid mucosal layer or less compliant mucosal layer, your swallowing efficiency was significantly lowered. Okay? So clearly mucosal layer has a functional role, and now that has clinical relevance. So again, if somebody has swallowing problem, you cannot ignore the dysfunction of the mucosa. Okay? So you have to take that into account. So this is another example which we had. And in last few minutes, one last example. So if you do have a swallowing issue and you go to one of these physicians, one of the first things they're going to do is make you gag, right? They're going to put a manometer down your esophagus, okay, and make you swallow stuff. And as you swallow, they will take pressure readings, okay? That is what has been shown over here. This is your mouth area. This is your stomach area. So this vertical is exactly top to bottom, all right? And this is the time axis, okay? So if you are swallowing and I have a contraction, meaning high pressure, and it is pushing my food down, my high pressure zone in this time axis should go forward, right? That is what, or downward, right? That is what you are seeing here. What is remarkable in this plot, this is normal patient, okay? I mean, I shouldn't even call it patient, right? Patient means something is wrong. This is a normal subject. Yeah, that is the language that is used. You should see a uniform red there, okay? It is not, okay? What you see is there is redness, there is this transition zone, and then red. If the swallowing is like a consistent pattern, why is it not uniformly red that is going? Red being the level of high pressure, okay, in this case. The hypothesis was that there are neural activation in the top part, which contracts the muscle, and the bottom part, which are separate neural networks, okay? So when it goes at this transition zone from the top part to the bottom part, it is like handing over from one set of neurons to the next, okay? And in this handover, this baton passing, this kind of behavior happens, okay? So this transition zone behavior in a normal patient was considered to be formed solely because of neuronal activation being different in the proximal part and the distal part, okay? That could be true, okay? But what we hypothesized is that the primary mechanism is not that, okay? And so what did we do? So look at this fiber architecture. Actually, I did something like magicians do. I told you that, look, there are these vertical fibers and there are these horizontal fibers. I made you see what I wanted you to see in that slide. Actually, that is not the case. What you see is they are more helical. And they are more cross-sectional at the top and more vertical at the bottom. Okay. So there is a transition from fiber architecture here, as you can imagine, to here, which is more circular longitudinal, all right? So the fiber architecture is changing from the upper to the lower part. So there we go, and what we did was we developed two simulations where we basically had only circular longitudinal throughout, and more helical in the top portion and more circular longitudinal in the bottom portion. Again, these two are not separate tubes. These are concentric with each other. I'm just showing two different muscle layers. I don't know if I am going to be able to run this simulation very well. By the way, France is leading 1-0, so if anybody cares. So the left one is according to uniform fiber architecture, right? This is the transition, is according to this. This is, we hypothesize, is closer to reality, all right? Now, of course, does this produce a pressure pattern which is experimental, right? So here is the pressure pattern. Now from simulations it is straightforward to get, is that uniform thing that I said. You should get uniform red as you go down. That is exactly what we got there. Now when we have that transition case, the pattern was exactly like in experiments, all right? So that definitely, again, circumstantial evidence, but it strongly indicates that fiber architecture must play a role in this swallowing process, all right? And in fact, the transition region is exactly where this transition happens, okay, in experiments as well. So again, these are the kinds of things that is helping now. If you can understand normal function, that puts you in a better position to understand abnormal function, okay? So with that, I'm done. This is what I talked about, basically numerical methods, two applications. And I want to put up this slide and take any questions, if any. But I want to thank my students and collaborators, as well as the funding sources. All right?
Good time for questions? I've got one. That is, if I look at any fish, even one that doesn't have those fins,
Right.
I would guesstimate that their body taper is about 10 degrees.
Okay.
So why do all the computation if that seems to be the aerodynamic shape of the fish?
Right, right. So that is a good question, and quite frankly, our whole computational effort was not there to explain the streamlining of the body, because that was known from before.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that is not a new result.
Yeah, but you arrived at that number by looking at the forces resulting from the...
No, that was the fin force.
Yeah, from the fin.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. But when you have a body
Yep.
which does not have a rigid part and an undulatory part, which is typically the case, right? Then there is no such thing as there is a deforming part that has to be attached at a certain angle. So that question is not relevant for cases where the whole body is deforming.
Yeah.
So we particularly focused only on this case simply because we were interested in the fact that this animal keeps part of its body rigid, and we wanted rigid because it is easier to make underwater vehicles with rigid parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is, yeah, for that specific animal, it is a relevant question.
Yeah. Any other?
Yeah, I have a question for the neuromechanics.
Yeah.
Your model, I noticed that you simulate all these fishes, and the fish, then they're running around like this.
Yeah.
Can you use your model also simulate the C. elegans motion?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the C. elegans will be much smaller than the
Yeah.
fish.
So
What
is,
fish
yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we don't do C. elegans simply because it is a small animal, like you said, and there are a lot of people doing Stokes flow swimming.
Okay.
Okay, so our strength of our approach is purely at high Reynolds number, really. I mean, it can be done at low Reynolds number,
Yeah.
but it gives the capability to do things at high Reynolds number. So it was just a strategic decision for us to stay in the high Reynolds number regime. But one could do that C. elegans problem.
Yeah, the fish thing is also, it's big, and did you just follow one fish or see the pattern, or you could do the kind of a lot of the things?
Right, right. Schooling and group of
Yeah.
fish.
Oh, we did
No, we could go there in our it's computationally more intensive,
Yeah.
and I haven't gone in that direction where I'm looking at multiple fish swimming
that's what
together. But I'm focusing more on a single fish, trying to understand how it creates its movement. Again, that was a research strategic decision, but one could do multi-bodies, yeah. And there are interesting questions there. Like there is Kumatsakos who is doing that work, Petros Kumatsakos, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How did you experimentally measure that the transition in the fiber structure was at the same spot as?
All right. So the thing is that you know the length of the esophagus, I mean that particular case, and you kind of know where the transition is happening. So at what height the transition is happening in real experiments, you know from those pictures. And that is what we compared with the transition location in the pressure data. And they actually are around that is why actually we went through the trouble to actually develop a model. If those heights didn't match in the first place, we would not have bothered to do the simulations. Yeah, that's a good question.
So related to that, there's no neuroactivity associated with where that stress change happens.
So there is neural activity, but the activation is uniformly going down in that case.
Yeah, there's no...
Yeah, there is no, yeah.
way down.
So we purposely designed that simulation so that there is the same kind of activation in the top and bottom part. Yeah, we switched off that difference. I mean, we can add that, and we have those results as well.
Yeah, so that was a related question. If you input a specific neural
Yes.
activity
Yes.
could you replicate?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Maybe I should have had that slide. So we did one simulation also where it was uniformly longitudinal and circular throughout, no transition structurally, but neuronally there is a transition. We see the pressure pattern. It does change from top to bottom, but that pattern does not look like that peculiar transition shape that was in experiments. So the one I showed you, it actually looks like the same pattern, right? So it doesn't look the same, yeah, morphologically, yeah.
Question?
Yeah, I think the underwater fish robot is really cool. Are you competing with the traditional propeller-driven submarine, or is there a particular reason
Right.
for the different design?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. No, you don't compete in the propeller thing because they are good in a certain range, which is high-speed propulsion. But these animals are good for places where you need high maneuverability. That is the strength of this fish because it can go forward, back, without much trouble, right? So these particular robots are being designed for high maneuverability, and therefore application areas would not be to carry humans necessarily, but for reconnaissance mission or to go and look at things in murky regions where it's a lot of cluttered environment, right? Those kind of scenarios, it would be a good engineering solution. Yeah.
Another follow-up question regarding the simulation. Had your strategy of be used on, say, soft elastomers, like silicone stretchy stuff, that can be used, say, for a pneumatic system? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, from a computational point of view, right?
Yes.
I mean, that formulation is very general, and that FB term that I had, basically somehow you have to have a model to tell the core that this is activating some deformation. Okay? So as long as you have some reasonable hypothesis about that, yeah, I mean, that can be done. Yes.
This is a question related to the fish thing you may not have an answer to, but because you may not have looked at it. Flew a buddy of mine down to the Bahamas once to repair his boat in my aircraft, and while we were down there, we took it for a test run. And I was absolutely astounded. We saw some things that looked like rocks laying down there. It turned out to be manta rays. They just take off like a bat. I mean, they go like lightning almost. Do you know why they can do that so quickly? They're huge. Too.
Right. No, actually, in that evolutionary diagram, we did have manta rays.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah, and it falls within that same thing. It produces very high thrust very quickly.
Yeah.
And because its flapping is such that it is within that optimal range for maximizing thrust. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So in the slide on convergent evolution, you looked at the ancestors of modern wave creatures, and you said that they had emerged from that evolution. So how did you get the data of lambda by A for those ancestors?
No, so there was no lambda by A for the ancestors. It was known, and again, this is the question you should ask a biologist. I just took their word for it. But that particular species just did not have those long fins. You understand? So imagine that there is a species which does not have eyes. And then two species evolve from it, and they both have same kind of eyes. Now that is convergent evolution, right? Yes.
So how do you know it's convergent evolution as opposed to a congenital defect?
Okay.
Then it becomes inherited.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, probably, see, convergent evolution, again, I'm not a biologist, so let me be very clear. But the way it is looked upon is, first comment is, like I said, I consistently said, and this is something I have become careful because we publish in biology journals, this is circumstantial evidence, so you cannot be 100% certain. Now, how that particular long fin might have developed, maybe because of some genetic mutation, right? That is what you're saying. So yeah, so that is how these things start. But the convergent evolution, basically the theory says that once something develops, why did it keep propagating through the generations? The reason is maybe there was some advantage because of that feature that they obtained after that mutation.
Sort of like heart disease, it kind of gets passed on, right? Does your family have a history of heart disease?
Right, unless in that case, because we keep people alive by medicine, it gives propagating. If there was no medicine, those defects will die off actually.
Right, but not before the offspring. Okay.
Right, well, it depends on how early people die. Yeah.
I thought I saw, yeah.
I was just gonna ask, you like pointed out where they change from getting that ratio, like they don't have it and then they got fins and you found they had that ratio. I was just gonna ask if you looked at the future, if there's future species.
Oh, okay. No, we did not go that far.
Oh, okay, because then you don't really know if it changed back and it might just be.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. But actually, I don't have an answer to that, how biologists go about analyzing what future changes might or might not come. Okay, I simply don't have that expertise.
Okay, not in the future from now, but future from that. So like there.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right. So again, those are existing species. Now your question is, those blue ones, are there ones after that that have also got that feature? Right, yeah. Okay, so that question I can answer. So in that particular tree, we went so far as the tree is known. So there will be some situations. The blue ones are actually the first ones that came up with that feature. And in some cases in that plot, you do have species after that which also have that feature, as long as that fin existed, like you just said, right? If the fin goes away, then it is an irrelevant question, right? And then the question is, why did it lose that fin, right? Maybe because some other feature was developed and it had advantage based on that. I'll give you an example. I'm not abstract, right? When animals came from water to land, right? So if you are going to remain in water, right, fin-like structures were an advantage, right? But as you started coming out, fin-like structure are no longer an advantage. Rather, you would have a limb-like structure. So it left the fin-like structure behind, which is still a better solution if you swam, right? But if you're going to spend more time on land, then that previous optimal solution is no good. You drop it and you develop limbs, which is the new optimal solution for land, right? So it could be that. So it's
Why not wheels?
Why? Don't ask me. I would like an answer to that question as well.
Any other questions? If not, let me thank you again. That was a very, very interesting talk. Thank you again.
Thank you.